we're off. Right, evening everybody. It is Friday, 18th November. It's cold outside, hence me having a nice big thick jumper on because I've just taken the dog for a walk and it is freaking freezing. And it's time for Dram 300. Another milestone. We just keep chugging along. 300, bloody hell. That's a lot. That's a lot. Not much more to go though, only another 66. Right, you'd think I'd be sick of whiskey by now, wouldn't you? Not. You'd think I'd be sick of Speysides as well. I'm kind of getting a bit sick of continual Glens, of which this is another one. But no, I'm not. I did get questioned as to whether I really wanted to do 50 Speysides all in a row. But I'm kind of glad I did, because it's been quite interesting kind of seeing the differences between them, even though they're from very, very close places. And I've just had to change what I was going to do after this one, because I found out it's linked to another distillery that I'm going to do later on. So that schedule that I've got up that's on the bottom here, it's subject to change. So this particular one, Glendullan, sample very kindly donated by Craig Moody of Boom Whisky, boomwhisky.co.uk. If you are near or around Manchester and you're looking for people to do whiskey tastings with and corporate events and things like that, get in touch with Craig, go to the website, tell him I sent you, and they'll sort you out. So Glendullan, cheers Craig for that, thank you very much. Glendullan was built in 1898 here, it's just east of Dufton, on the River Dullan, hence Glendullan, Valley of the River Dullan, by a company they were blenders from Aberdeen, and they were brilliantly called William Williams and Sons. Parents must have really thought long and hard about what to call their son. So yeah, William Williams and Sons were that created the distillery, built it, and sort of ticked along quite nicely, considering it was the turn of the century. There was recession, there was this Patterson crisis, where I'm not going to go into it again, lots of difficulties. They managed to kind of struggle through, but by the time we got to 1926, post First World War, things were struggling, and Distillers Company Limited, DCL, around that time were picking up a lot of distilleries that otherwise probably would have just disappeared off the face of the earth. So DCL took it, and they were, if you've not seen any other videos, or you're not aware, or you've just not been paying attention to the other videos I've been doing, in which case, thanks, essentially our precursor to Diageo. DCL, was it SMD, all various acronyms, UDV, VHS, AKA, CIA, whatever, all became Diageo eventually. And DCL took it over in 1926. And again, kind of like was ticking along quite nicely, doing okay, was being used in blends as a lot of single malt distilleries, basically with the exception of Glenfiddich, up to about mid-1980s, with the exception of Glenfiddich and a few single malt whiskies that were very popular in Italy, of all places, where there's quite a big demand for very young single malt whiskies in the sort of 60s and 70s. Single malt was almost non-existent, it just all went into blends. And it was just ticking along. It was basically Bells, Johnnie Walker and Old Parr were the three that it was a big chunk of. And in 1972, another distillery was built in the grounds, so it's essentially next door, but it was still Glendullan. So it kind of muddies the waters a bit, because it was technically a different distillery, but it was essentially Glendullan number 2. And what, not Diageo, but what DCL would do at the time is it was two separate buildings separated by not a lot, and they'd make whiskey separately, but then just vat it together and send it off to wherever. So if there was any Glendullan available, it would essentially be a vatted or blended malt, whatever you want to call it now. It technically, strictly speaking, legally as it is now, with the Scotch Whisky Association and EU laws and all that lot, that wouldn't have been a single malt. Even though they were within the same grounds and they had the same name, it's technically two different distilleries. But at that time, not really bothered. Just, yeah, it's fine, whatever, we'll just do it. Because there wasn't a really big single malt market, and there wasn't any legislation in place, and there wasn't a Scotch Whisky Association to go, this is how you must do it. So the old Glendullan, which is a bit like Brora and Clynelish, where you had Brora, then there was Clynelish that was built over the road. The old Brora shut, Clynelish continued, there is still Brora, it's all very complicated. The old Glendullan distillery was then closed down in 1985 when the market was pretty much kind of bottoming out, and it was a lot of distilleries were closing around that time. So the Glendullan that you'll find now from the Glendullan distillery is actually from a Glendullan distillery in 1972, not the original in 1898, because that doesn't exist anymore. It's basically used as a workshop and warehouse and things like that. So still with Diageo, and still a big part of blends. So there's not a lot. There is a Singleton version. There was a Flora and Fauna version that was a 12-year-old. And there is, Glendullan is now part of the Diageo Singleton range. So we did the Glen Crap, what was it? Not the Glen Crap. The Glen, that'd be an interesting name, wouldn't it? I've had that many Glens so far. I can't even remember which one it was now. Which Dufton? There was a Singleton of Dufton. They also do the Uchthusk, they do a Glenord, and they do the Glendullan. So that is basically the way that you would be able to get a Glendullan. Now, I couldn't source a sample of it. Craig very kindly offered me this because I still had Glendullan on the list that I hadn't got a sample of. This particular one, this, is a bottling from Hunter Lang. So it's an independent bottling. Now, Hunter Lang is an offshoot of Douglas Lang. There was Douglas and Fred Lang. And sorry, not Douglas and Fred Lang, it was Fred and what's his name? How can I forget his name? Basically, the two brothers that were running Douglas Lang split a number of years ago, and there's the Douglas Lang, which is owned by Fred, but then there's also this kind of offshoot of Hunter Lang, or is it one of their sons? I can't remember. When I talk about, let's go back and see my Timorous Beastie and Big P and Rock Oyster and Scallywag reviews, because that's where I talk about what happened with the Lang family and how it all splits apart. But Hunter Lang is the sort of the separation of Douglas Lang, and Hunter Lang is a sort of competitor, sort of. And this particular bottling looks like this. I'm just going to have to dive onto my iPod to double check pronunciation, because it's a sort of range from Hunter Lang called Douglas of Drumlanrig. And apparently Douglas of Drumlanrig, I'm guessing is how you pronounce it, is a person. He is a duke. Now, it's the Duke of something and Queensferry, this bloke called Douglas. And I'm not even going to try and pronounce it without looking on the net first. I should have done this first, but I didn't, so deal with it. Talk amongst yourselves for a second. How to pronounce, apparently, right, so this is what he is the Duke of, alright? Not a clue. And Yahoo Answers, apparently it says, Buccleuch, okay? Buccleuch, although I've always pronounced this Buccleuch, as in lock or back. Dorothy, whoever she is, told me that the Duke himself pronounces it as Buccleuch. So there you go. He's the Duke of Buccleuch. How can he take himself seriously? He's the Duke of Buccleuch and Queensferry, apparently. And he supposedly endorses the whiskies that Hunter Lang select for them. So it's not cask strength, and interestingly, it's not cask strength, it's not 50%, it's 46%. It's 411 bottles, from what I could read on the front label. It was distilled in 2001 and bottled in 2014, so it's a 13-year-old. And it was matured in refill hogshead sherry casks. So I'm certainly guessing with the very pale colour to this that, as with Douglas Lang, they're not adding any colouring to it, and probably not doing any chill filtration either. The Whisky Shop seem to have an exclusive on it, and I have a feeling that the Whisky Shop do have exclusivity on Hunter Lang, or at least quite a lot of their lines. They were the only one I could find selling this, and they were selling this for 69 quid. So, you know, you look at it and go, 69 quid for a 13-year-old? Single cask? There's 411 bottles, so I'm guessing it's single cask. Seems a little on the steep side. It is the Whisky Shop, so it probably will be on the steep side anyway. But yes, it seems a slightly high price. But Glendullan's hard to get hold of. It's easier now that there's the Singleton version. I know it started off, because I think the Singleton of Glendullan was 2007 they launched it, I'm going to say. And I think it started off as exclusive to the US. Basically, the Singleton range was, the US had one, UK had another, Europe had another, and Asia had another one. So I think it was Asia had Glenord, America had Glendullan, the UK had maybe Uchthusk, and the Europe had whatever the other one is, because my mind's gone blank. But apparently now it's become, that's less so, and I think it was just travel retail, and now it's not anymore, and I think it's a lot easier to get all of them should you wish to collect them. So it's still hard to get hold of. Glendullan generally, it's still predominantly used in blends, so it's not an obvious one to find on a shelf unless it's a really specialist whiskey shop. So like I say, the colour, hopefully you'll be able to pick that out. It's pretty damn light considering it's a refill sherry cask and 13 years. That's light. And that's spicy. It's quite dry as well. It's kind of like a dry, almost chili spice. There's chili spice and white pepper. And there's almost like chopped up jalapenos. I love jalapeno peppers. Love the stuff. Try and stick them in everything that I can. Obviously not what the kids are eating, but I really, really like jalapeno peppers. Red ones. Less so keen on green, but red jalapenos. Love the stuff. And this has that kind of the raw spiciness of if you've just chopped up jalapeno peppers and they're sort of on the chopping board, and you get a bit of a whiff of that chili, and there's a slight juiciness to it because it's fresh chopped chili. But there is a slight dryness to it as well. It's odd. It's almost, the dryness is kind of sandy. God, that sounds pretentious. That's ridiculous. I apologise for that because that sounds like absolute nonsense. But there's a weird, kind of evocative of like sort of spice and sand and deserts and things. And there's a slight pepperiness to it as well. It's not really overpowering, and it's not like, Jesus, this is chilly, but it's there. How unusual. Oh, whoa. And it's there on the palate as well, but it's supported by this quite sugary sweetness. And it's quite a clean sweetness as well. We're not talking caramel, we're talking sugar solution. We're not talking like thick golden syrup. This is like a really clean melting sugar into water on a pan, but before it caramelizes and before it crystallizes, when it's still a clear sugar solution, as well as like a chili spice and it's not quite black pepper. It's more like a very finely ground pepper. If you go to like a fish and chip shop and you get those little shakers of pepper where it's not black, it's sort of like a grey colour. It's that sort of pepperiness where it's a little bit lighter. I tell you what, the alcohol percentage is bang on. I wouldn't want it any higher, but I certainly wouldn't want it any lower because it just gives enough of a bite to support the spiciness that's there. It's a really weird juxtaposition of kind of very pure, clean sweetness and then this spiciness as well. But they work fantastically well. It's a really good combination of sweet and spice that if it was misjudged, if it was if they hadn't not worked on it, but if they hadn't picked the right one, it would be kind of like, oh, this really isn't working, I'm getting knocked from all sides here. But the combination of the two, sweet and savoury on this is almost kind of like salt and vinegar crisps, that sort of sharpness, but with a lovely kind of sweetness to it as well that offsets. Salt and vinegar, you're probably going, well, salt and vinegar is crisp, not sweet. What are you talking about? But there is a kind of underlying sweetness to it that works. There is a juxtaposition of flavours, and this works. This is really, really nice, but it's very clean. It tastes very pure. That's really good. But it's like I say, it's a pure flavour. It's a pure sweetness and a pure spiciness. It's not rich or deep. There's a nice silky mouthfeel to it, but the flavours that you get are very crisp. But they work. They don't bounce off each other. They're not separate. They amalgamate into each other and work really well. I am very, very impressed with this indeed. Is it worth 69 quid? It's bloody good. It feels still a bit steep, to be honest. But considering how young this is, as a standalone, if I could find this cheaper, if it was like 50 quid, I'd say actually, yes, that's a decent price. But 69 feels a little bit too much to my liking. I wouldn't be comfortable paying that, but it is very, very good indeed. I'm really liking this. But this is much more of a, it's kind of a spring whiskey. It's not quite delicate enough. It's a little bit spicier to be able to say this would be lovely on a spring day or on a summer's afternoon or something like that. It's not quite light enough. It's got a little bit too much spice and a little bit too much of a silky mouthfeel. But it's not a winter whiskey. It's not one to be sat in front of a log fire. It's almost a palate cleanser, maybe. Sweetness maybe a little bit too much. But the equivalent of it's like a whiskey equivalent of that sorbet that you get when you're having like a 5-course meal. And you have your starter, and then you have the sorbet as a palate cleanser, and it's got that sharpness but a slight sweetness to it as well. That is what that is. Craig, mate, thanks for that. That is an absolute cracker. I really, really enjoyed that. Very, very distinctive, unusual, very unspace-ID. But very, very, very good. Right. Actually, I wasn't expecting a particularly good one for 300. It was a bit like, Glendullan. No, don't think I've had it before, and it's not really kind of like a big name or anything like that to do 300. But actually, a really good whiskey to see off my 3rd century. Jesus, that sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But yeah, a really, really nice whiskey to hit 300. Well chuffed with that. Really, really enjoyable. I'm going to do a quick rinse out and then I'm going to do another one. And then the ones after that, the 2 after this next one, should be quite special because I'm going to be getting some help. Ooh, exciting. Right, I'll see you at the next one. Cheers.